Hail Internet, it's Matt here for the Dork Lords. If you're new to the channel, welcome. We talk about all manner of dorkly things here, so whether it's sci-fi, fantasy, superheroes, we probably have a playlist about it. Feel free to check us out. Today is another in our Dork Lord of the Rings segments. And today's topic is Dol Amroth. And if you're out there asking, what's Dol Amroth? Good question. And full disclosure, that wasn't going to be the initial topic for today. The topic was going to be Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, character who shows up in Lord of the Rings, has a fairly significant part to play in the Battle of Pelennor Fields and what comes after. But in researching Imrahil, I found some really cool, interesting, tragic, dramatic facts about the place he comes from, Dol Amroth. And so we're going to start with the foundation of what this place is, how it gets its name, and then we're going to transition into Imrahil specifically, and we'll end on him. So, all right. Actually, to get to Dol Amroth, we have to start first in Lothlorien, or as the locals call it back in the day, Lorien. All right, we're going to take you back, way back. Remember, the War of the Ring is at the end of the Third Age. So thousands and thousands of years earlier, in what they call the Years of the Trees. This is before the First Age even. Many of the elves do what they call the Great Journey. And they journey west. They're going to go back across the sea to Aman, to Valinor. Some of the elves decide, nope, we're not going back. We're just going to stay where we are, thanks. And one subset of those elves are the Sylvan Elves. And many of those Sylvan Elves end up settling in two forests that are very close together. There's the Greenwood Elves, and then there's the Elves of Lothlorien. And so they are there for a long time. So one of the Sylvan Elves who takes up residence in Lorien is Nimrodel. And Nimrodel is not a queen. She's not royalty necessarily. She's not some title of prominence. But she has a huge part to play in this story. And Nimrodel lives by the banks of a river that becomes known as Nimrodel. Even in the Third Age, the river Nimrodel, in fact, Frodo and the company end up crossing the river Nimrodel. She lives there, and here, as Legolas says in the Fellowship of the Ring, he describes how she lives by the banks of this river. It is told she had a house built in the branches of a tree that grew near the falls, for that was the custom of the elves of Lorien, to dwell in the trees, and maybe it is so still. Therefore they were called the Galathrim, the tree people. So she's living up in the trees, got a tree house near the waterfalls of the river that bears her name, Nimrodel. And in fact, Legolas goes on to sing a song about Nimrodel in the Fellowship of the Ring. I'll set this up here, and I'll read you a couple of stanzas. I won't read you the entire song, but here we go. At length a silence fell, and they heard the music of the waterfall running sweetly in the shadows. Frodo almost fancied he could hear a voice singing, mingled with the sound of the water. "Do you hear the voice of Nimrodel?" said Legolas. "I will sing you a song of the maiden Nimrodel, who bore the same name as the stream beside which she lived long ago. An elven maid there was of old, a shining star by day. Her mantle white was hemmed with gold, her shoes of silver gray. Beside the falls of Nimrodel, by water clear and cool, her voice as falling silver fell into the shining pool. Where now she wanders none can tell, in sunlight or in shade, for lost of yore was Nimrodel, and in the mountains strayed." So that's setting up what's coming. Okay, so what we've got is Nimrodel, Sylvan Elf. Sylvan Elves are living in Lorien. She's living up in the trees. Hangs out by a river that bears her name, Nimrodel. All right. First Age comes to a close with the War of Wrath. Elves and the Valar send an army, and they defeat Morgoth and put him up into the void. All right. So now there are a lot more elves in Middle-earth. And one such group of elves are the Sindar. The Sindar start commingling with the Sylvan elves. And they don't necessarily take over these areas by force. It's not like a hostile takeover, but it feels to me a little bit like, a crime scene that you see on TV when the FBI show up. They're like, all right, who's in charge? Not anymore. Flash the badge, and the Sindar take over. So, in Greenwood, it's the Sindar elf Oropher who becomes king of the Sylvan elves, even though he himself is not a Sylvan elf. Oropher is Legolas's grandfather. In Lorien, it's the Sindar elf Amdir who becomes, again, king of Sylvan elves, even though he's not a Sylvan elf. And so there's some resentment among the locals to the Sindar elves that come in and kind of take control. One of the people that really resents the presence of the Sindar elves is Nimrodel. She refuses to speak in the Sindar dialect. She continues to talk with the Sylvan dialect. She still lives apart from most of the society. She lives by the river, kind of off on her own, a little bit away from the actual civilization. And so, yeah, she sees these elves not only as they came in and took over, but also they brought war with them. When they showed up, this war of wrath happened. The earth was broken in many pieces, and there was death and destruction. And she lays that at the feet of these kind of interloper elves. Well, the one Sindar elf that she cares for is Amdir's son, Amroth. So we finally got the name Amroth. There it is. Done. No, okay. But this is the guy for whom Dol Amroth is named. Now, he's at the moment hanging out in Lorien in an inland forest, and the place that bears his name, Dol Amroth, is on the coast. So you're like, how did he name a place that's nowhere near the place where he's living? Well, hang on, we're getting there. All right, so Amroth is also very much in love with Nimrodel. She refuses to marry him, and he doesn't take any other wife because he's carrying a torch for her, essentially. So Amdir, Amroth's dad, rules Lorien for many years. One little note in there, in the year 1700 or so, 1701, something like that, of the Second Age, Galadriel and Celeborn, who have been living in Lorien, decide to leave, and they head for the coast. They head for this port town called Ethelond. That coincides with the end of kind of Sauron's first big bid for power. When the rings first got forged, and there was this giant upheaval. We will probably see those events happen in the Amazon series, I would guess. But as a result of that, Galadriel and Celeborn decide, you know what, we're going to move away from all this strife, and we're going to go down to the coast. And so they end up moving fairly close to what becomes known as Dol Amroth. Ethelond is this, as I mentioned, a port town. Think of it like the Grey Havens. So in Lord of the Rings, the Grey Havens are where the elves get on the ships and they head west. Well, Ethelond is a similar place. The elves could get on ships and depart for the west, but Ethelond is way farther south. I'll put up a map, but it's way farther south than the Grey Havens. So it's a little easier for some of these elves to get there, to get to Ethelond, as opposed to traveling all the way across country to try to get to the Grey Havens. So that's just a state of affairs. Galadriel and Celeborn are, at this moment, not living in Lorien. Obviously, they return eventually. Get to the end of the Second Age. So now you've got the War of Last Alliance. That's where the elves and men get together to try to take on Sauron. Sylvan elves send armies, And at the head of those armies, you've got King Oropher and King Amdir. One of the last big battles of that war is the Battle of Dagorlad. It takes place on the plains of Dagorlad, which is just pretty much right there in the shadow of the Black Gate. So they're almost there. They're about to lay siege to Sauron. Big battle happens. And there's basically, I don't want to get too much in the weeds here, but there's an ill-advised charge that the Sylvan Elves do. And Oropher and Amdir both get killed in this charge. The death and destruction that happened as a result of that is what gives the origin of the Dead Marshes that you see in like those elven bodies that are lying in the water and stuff. These are the Amdir and Oropher's folks are the ones that are in those dead marshes. So Amdir's dead. New king is Amroth. He becomes king as a result of those actions. So just FYI, with Oropher's death, Thranduil becomes king of Greenwood, at Legolas's dad. So Amroth is now king. He would love for Nimrodel to be his queen. She continues to resist. And you still get this idea that throughout this story, she's constantly having to make a choice between this personal love she has for this person versus her love for the land. And more or less, she pretty constantly chooses the land over the person. So that state of affairs goes on for a while. They're courting, let's say, but they are not king and queen. Around 1050 of the Third Age, we're now in the Third Age, so 1,000 years or so since Amroth became king, Greenwood starts turning into Mirkwood. Right? Dol Guldur, the necromancer, shows up. I'm not sure if everybody's figured out yet that it's Sauron, but anyway, Sauron's returned to Dol Guldur. The area starts to become more evil. And what Amroth does is he builds this big mound in Lorien. He circles it with 2 rings of trees, and then in the center of this mound he's got this giant tree, and he builds a big platform up in the tree. They're known as flets. But basically, this is an homage to what the Sylvan Elves do, what Nimrodel had. She's got her tree house. He built this platform up in the tree, and part of the reason for that, part of it was, hey, this is what Nimrodel and the Sylvan Elves do. I will be like them. But another reason was he wanted a very high place so that he could look out across the way and he could actually spy on Dol Guldur. He could see it in the distance. And so this mound with this ring of trees, 2 rings of trees, and the giant tree with the flet on it was Cerin Amroth, became known as Cerin Amroth. Amroth's Mound. Well, Cerin Amroth, huge part to play in The Lord of the Rings. That is where Aragorn first was betrothed to Arwen. It's also where Arwen goes to die. So Cerin Amroth, very huge place of prominence in what becomes Lothlorien. And it is named for this guy, Amroth. So, our king of Lorien is now keeping an eye on Dol Guldur, but everything seems all right. Another 1,000 years go by. Now we're in 1980, I think, of the Third Age. So there's Rubik's Cubes and Tetris. No, okay. No, it's this is when the Balrog is released from Moria. Moria is very close to Lorien. If you remember in Lord of the Rings, right? Gandalf falls off the bridge of Khazad-dûm, and immediately they get in. The group ends up in Lorien. So it's very close by. Well, when the Balrog is released, it scares a lot of elves, because not only is the Balrog there, but now orcs are starting to come into that area as well. When the dwarves left, the orcs took over, and it's becoming a much less safe place to be. So elves kind of start bailing on the region. In fact, heading for that Ethelond, sailing west, just getting out of Dodge. So one of the people that decide, heck with this, I have to flee, is Nimrodel. And one day she's just gone. And so Amroth goes to find her. So here's a passage describing those events. But when the terror came out of Moria, and the dwarves were driven out, and in their stead orcs crept in, she, Nimrodel, fled, distraught, alone, south into empty lands. Amroth followed her, and at last he found her under the eaves of Fangorn, which in those days drew much nearer to Lorien. She dared not enter the wood, for the trees, she said, menaced her, and some moved to bar her way. There Amroth and Nimrodel held a long debate, and at the last they plighted their troth. To this I will be true, she said, and we shall be wedded when you bring me to a land of peace. Amroth vowed that for her sake he would leave his people, even in their time of need, and with her seek for such a land. But there is none now in Middle-earth, he said, and will not be for the elven folk ever again. We must seek for a passage over the great sea to the ancient west. So, wow. Here's this guy. He's willing to give up his kingship, even though, as he mentions, his people need him in this moment, for the love of Nimrodel. And he's like, okay, I get your requirement is that we live in a land of peace. Can't find it here. We need to go west. And the way to go west is to go to this Ethelond, and we're going to get on a boat, and we'll sail west together, you and me. So she's in agreement with that. So they begin traveling from Fangorn to Ethelond. And there's a small retinue of elves with them. Specifically, Nimrodel has some handmaidens with her. One of them becomes very important later. Mithrellas. We'll just throw her name out there. So, this is the weird part. Somewhere along the way, they get separated. And why they get separated is a bit of a mystery. But Amroth ends up going on ahead. As I say, this part is a little ambiguous, but there is one part of the myth that says that upon arriving at the river Gilrine, Nimrodel was so taken with it and its memory to her of the river Nimrodel that she stayed by its banks and she fell into a deep sleep, and she ended up, basically sleeping so long that she was separated from Amroth. Seems a little odd. That doesn't seem to work so well for me. Plus the fact that she's already got a retinue with her. So what were the handmaidens also? Was it a magical sleep everybody fell into? It's maybe more metaphorical, I think, perhaps. But in any case, Amroth gets way ahead of her, ends up going to Ethelond. And it's a lucky thing that Amroth does go ahead, because he ends up arriving when there's only one ship left. Ethelond is being kind of abandoned, and there's only one group of elves that are left to go west at this point. And Amroth convinces them, hey, hold up. Nimrodel's on her way, my true love. I will be happy to sail with you and help do work on the ship, but I need my true love with me. So here's a passage that describes what's going on here. Because the seasons are changing, and so the boat's only got a limited kind of window of time before it really needs to get going if it's going to go. The year was waning to autumn, and before long great winds were to be expected, hostile and dangerous, even to elven ships while they were still near to Middle-earth. But so great was the grief of Amroth that nonetheless they stayed their going for many weeks, and they lived on the ship, for their houses on the shore were stripped and empty. Then in the autumn there came a great night of storm, one of the fiercest in the annals of Gondor, and many of the ships of men were swept out into the Bay of Belfalis and lost. So he's staying on the ship, waiting many weeks. So if she was asleep for a long time by this river. And he's waiting, she's not there. One night while they're on board, this storm comes up and it loses its moorings, and the ship gets kind of washed out to sea. And I'm going to pick up now a little bit more with the song that Legolas was singing originally about Nimrodel, those stanzas I read. Here's some stanzas that and the poem are about Amroth. Amroth beheld the fading shore, now low beyond the swell, and cursed the faithless ship that bore him far from Nimrodel. Of old he was an elven king, a lord of tree and glen, when golden were the boughs in spring in fair Lothlorien. From helm to sea they saw him leap, as arrow from the string, and dive into the water deep, as mew upon the wing. But from the west has come no word, and on the hither shore no tidings elven folk have heard of Amroth evermore. So yeah, he leaps into the water. He realizes, no, we're getting away from shore. I have to go back. And so he jumps and he tries to swim to shore. And there's some accounts where the elves on the shore can see his like gleaming, his yellow blonde hair like gleaming in the sun for hours as he's trying to swim. And then he disappears beneath the waves. And he's never seen again. So Amroth has drowned. The other elves aboard the ship decide, you know what? This is it. We got to get going anyway. We're heading off. And the ship actually does get to the west. Those elves survive the journey. But unfortunately, Amroth never makes it to the west. At that point, Nimrodel does show up in Ethelond late. The boat's not there. It's unclear, but I don't think she is informed that he drowned. And I think maybe in her mind he's taken off to the west. And so she returns to the mountains, and we never hear from her again. Nimrodel disappears from Tolkien's mythology at that point. You can make some argument that, okay, if Amroth perished, if his form perished, his spirit would go back to the halls of Mandos, and then perhaps they could be reunited. If Nimrodel perished, they could be back in the halls of Mandos together. But as we know, suicide's not a thing, except for the guy Mathros that we talked about last week. Basically, elves aren't doing the suicide thing. So it could be the tragedy that she continues to live on. He's in the halls of Mandos waiting for her to maybe show up, and she never does. And so they miss each other, essentially. And so it's a very tragic tale, but you do get the sense that Nimrodel, while she did love Amroth, it says very plainly she loved him, she didn't love him as much as the land that she, came to know as her home. And so when the choice came, his choice obviously was, you are more important to me than wherever I'm going to end up being. But to her, it was, I think the idea is she would rather be alone in the land she loved than be together in a land that she didn't. And so because Amroth drowned just off the coast of Ethelond, where this peninsula that juts out into the Bay of Belfalis, that area became known as Dol Amroth, the Hill of Amroth. There's this promontory, almost like a little cliffside, that looks out over the bay, and the castle Dol Amroth gets built on top of that promontory, and that's where the princes of Dol Amroth end up living. So as I said, Nimrodel is never seen again, but one of her handmaidens, Mithrellas, is found wandering by the lord of the Belfalis region at that time, Imrazor. They get married. Imrazor is a human, she's an elf, but they have kids. And the first male child born, Galador, becomes the first prince of Dol Amroth. And he's a half-elf. He's got elven blood in him. And so that lineage carries on several generations until we reach the time of the War of the Ring, when the current prince of Dol Amroth is Imrahil, which means Imrahil has some elven blood in him. An interesting side note is that one member of the house of Dol Amroth, a woman named Morwen, ends up marrying Theoden's dad, who is, Thengel at that time was the king of Rohan. So Morwen marries Thengel. She has Theoden. She has other kids as well, and so she's also the grandmother of Eomer and Eowyn, which means that they've got a little bit of elven blood in them. If they did the 23andMe, they, the stats would come back and would say, you are 5% Sylvan Elf from the Lorien region. So I find that interesting that there's this little through line of elven blood in the Kings of Rohan, and also in the Princes of Dol Amroth. Imrahil is the brother-in-law of Denethor. So Imrahil's sister married Denethor, which also means he's the uncle of Boromir and Faramir. And when the time comes for the Battle of Pelennor Fields, Minas Tirith is under attack, and they call out, Gondor sends for aid. One of the groups that answers is the Prince of Dol Amroth. I'm going to read you here the account of he and his knights arriving to lend aid. And last and proudest, Imrahil, Prince of Dol Amroth, kinsman of the Lord, with gilded banners bearing his token of the ship and the silver swan, and a company of knights in full harness riding grey horses, and behind them 700 of men-at-arms, tall as lords, grey-eyed, dark-haired, singing as they came. And so there he comes. He's got the symbol of the ship and the silver swan, and he has a very formidable, small but formidable fighting force that he brings to bear. And I'm going to read you a passage here where Legolas meets up with Imrahil and immediately can recognize his elven heritage. And I find it really interesting because it plays back into this whole Nimrodel and Amroth legend. At length they came to the Prince Imrahil, and Legolas looked at him and bowed low, for he saw that here indeed was one who had elven blood in his veins. "Hail, Lord," he said. "It is long since the people of Nimrodel left the woodlands of Lorien, and yet still one may see that not all sailed from Amroth's haven west over water." "So it is said in the lore of my land," said the prince. "Yet never has one of the fair folk been seen there for years beyond count. And I marvel to see one here now, in the midst of sorrow and war." So you can tell that Legolas is impressed with Imrahil and what he comes to bear, and is obviously familiar with the lineage of the princes of Dol Amroth, that they go back to King Amroth of Lorien. Here's another passage that I think is indicative of how much weight Tolkien gave to this character Imrahil. He really gave him this prominence that put him on par with some of the major characters in the story. Aragorn and Eomer and Imrahil rode back towards the gate of the city, and they were now weary beyond joy or sorrow. These three were unscathed, for such was their fortune and the skill and might of their arms, and few indeed had dared to abide them or look on their faces in the hour of their wrath. But many others were hurt or maimed or dead upon the field. So yeah, he basically puts him in the company of Aragorn and Eomer, like he's in that league of champions. So a really formidable character here in the story. And as further evidence of his prominence, here's a passage where Gandalf gives Imrahil basically command of the field. "They met the Prince Imrahil, and he called to them, 'Whither now, Mithrandir? The Rohirrim are fighting on the fields of Gondor. We must gather all the strength that we can find.' 'You will need every man and more,' said Gandalf. 'Make all haste. I will come when I can, but I have an errand to the Lord Denethor that will not wait. Take command in the Lord's absence.'" And so Imrahil takes command of the field while Gandalf withdraws. And subsequently, there's a couple other really important actions that Imrahil takes. One, he is the first to realize that Eowyn is not dead after she kills the Witch King and looks like she's been killed herself. They're taking her body and Theoden's body, basically towards the crypts. And he stops them, and he notices that she's still breathing. And so he's the one that's like, no, don't take her to the morgue. Take her to the houses of healing. She can be saved. And so, but for him, Eowyn probably doesn't survive in that moment. Another person that he does a lot to save is Faramir. So he doesn't appear in the movies so much, and you can understand why. He's a major minor character, right? And so what they do is they give his actions to other characters in the movies. But one of the things he does in the books is he's the guy who helps save Faramir when Faramir makes that ill-fated charge. He makes a charge of his own, right? So Amdir and Oropher made that ill-fated charge back in the War of the Last Alliance. Well, when Faramir makes his ill-fated charge, it's Imrahil who helps save his life, and in fact pulls the arrow that's like a poisoned arrow out of him, tries to patch him up, keep him alive long enough until Aragorn can come and do some of the real healing. So in any case, he has a part to play in saving his nephew's life, and also Eowyn's life. And at the point where it's obvious now that Denethor has committed suicide, and yet Faramir is essentially in a coma, there's no steward. There's no acting steward of Gondor. And so Imrahil is made steward. At that point, Aragorn doesn't want to just come in and take over. It's kind of the wrong time in his mind to make his grand, I am their king returned. He's like, let's wait till the fighting's over first. So he'd rather not do that. He doesn't. And instead, Imrahil is this acting steward. So for a short period of time, he is the steward of Gondor. He is also fully in Camp Aragorn. And so, he makes it much easier for Aragorn to transition when the time comes, as opposed to Denethor. If Denethor had still been alive, obviously he was way against Aragorn. So that by having Imrahil as steward, the relationship between Gondor and Aragorn much better. But you get to this point after the Battle of Pelennor Fields is finished, when Aragorn and Gandalf make the decision, all right, we're going to send our small force at the Black Gate to try to distract Sauron, to try to draw his forces out of Mordor to make it easier for Frodo. Now in the Return of the King, the movie, you've got that line from Gimli. It's a great line where he's like, certainty of death, small chance of success. What are we waiting for? And so that spirit, kind of the almost gallows humor of sorts, is given to Imrahil in the books. He doesn't have that line. It's not quite as pithy, but I'm going to read you here. This is Imrahil reacting to the news that, yep, our group's going to march on the Black Gate. When they had reckoned up all their strength and taken thought for the journeys they should make and the roads they should choose, Imrahil suddenly laughed aloud. Love that. Surely, he cried, this is the greatest jest in all the history of Gondor, that we should ride with 7,000s, scarce as many as the vanguard of its army in the days of its power, to assail the mountains and the impenetrable gate of the Black Land. So might a child threaten a mail-clad knight with a bow of string and green willow. If the Dark Lord knows as much as you say, Mithrandir, will he not rather smile than fear, and with his little finger crush us like a fly that tries to sting him? No, he will try to trap the fly and take the sting, said Gandalf. And there are names among us that are worth more than 1,000 mail-clad knights apiece. No, he will not smile. Neither shall we, said Aragorn. If this be jest, then it is too bitter for laughter. Nay, it is the last move in a great jeopardy, and for one side or the other, it will bring the end of the game. Then he drew Anduril and held it up, glittering in the sun. You shall not be sheathed again until the last battle is fought, he said. So yeah, you have this moment here where Imrahil is questioning the wisdom of this basically suicide mission. And when Gandalf says there are names among us that are worth more than 1,000 mail-clad knights apiece, I think one of those knights would be Imrahil himself. And in fact, he does survive the battle at the Black Gate. He goes on to rule into the Fourth Age. He passes away of natural causes. His son rules after him. And so all is well in there for the princes of Dol Amroth. Also, Éomer marries Imrahil's daughter. So there's more of a family connection there between the princes of Dol Amroth and the kings of Rohan. So there you go. Dol Amroth. What began as a fairly anonymous peninsula out on the Bay of Belfalis had this tragic event happen from which it gets its name, Dol Amroth, where you get this elven infusion into the lineage of the princes of Dol Amroth, leads up to Prince Imrahil, steward of Gondor, uncle of Faramir, who helps win the War of the Ring. So if you've got a topic you'd like me to talk about, please feel free to put it in the comments. Be happy to do a video about a topic of your choice. And thanks a lot, everybody. We'll talk to you next time. Bye.